So without further ado, let me talk about this topic, the Nestorians. My guess is that few, if any, of you had ever heard of the Nestorians before hearing about this talk. They are a topic that is dear to my heart because they're very important in Asian history. But before beginning, a few comments about this week versus last week in the Armenians. These are both traditions that had comparable starting times, basically in the 4th and 5th centuries. It was a period of time of great ferment about theology, and we will come back to that in a few minutes. And so we see these traditions going. On the one hand, the Armenians created a tradition that was focused upon a people and a place. And that was Armenia, even though obviously Armenians themselves have migrated to many quarters of the earth since then. There are still, Binghamton has an Armenian church. The Nestorians had no such place. The Nestorians were a tradition that began as basically, it was a kind of a theological position. Anyway, they emerged as a great tradition throughout Asia. And in fact, I would say up until about the 13th century or so, in Asia itself, Christianity was basically synonymous with the Nestorians. So they are really a very important group to be considered. Okay, so Nestorius was a real historical person. He was a churchman. He was from, when I looked this up, Germanesia. It's not in Germany. Germanesia is in southern Turkey, not all that far from Odessa, and Antioch and so forth, one of the great church centers. We don't know a lot about his life, except that he was known to be a brilliant teacher with a honeyed tongue. His critics especially thought that this was something to be held against him. In 1428, he was named as the Patriarch of Constantinople, one of the very highest positions within the church at that time. However, 3 years later, he proceeded to be expelled at the Council of Ephesus, and in fact excommunicated. From there, he made his way to the east. He died in a town in Arabia in 451. So that might have been that, except that his life and the activities associated with him reverberated a great deal. A little bit about the Council of Ephesus. This is something that I still get. There are so many councils. The Nicene Council before that was the one that created the Nicene Creed that we just had this morning. And there were many, many different councils in the early church, especially after the church had been sort of created the official church within the Eastern Roman Empire with Constantinople and the like. So there were, if you try to follow these histories, it's kind of mind-boggling that they are really concerned with the issues of the nature of Christ, especially. And in fact, if you look within the Nicene Creed itself, there are phrases in there that were much, much argued over and so forth in the church councils before things were decided upon. But one of the key elements has to do with particularly the exact nature of Christ. In terms of what got Nestorius into trouble, a lot of it had to do with the way in which Mary was described. And one of the common descriptions of her was Mother of God. Nestorius said, that Christ was human as well as God. And so to answer that, he didn't want to say Mother of the man Jesus, but he said, well, perhaps it should be Mother of Christ, sort of sidestepping the whole issue. However, that was not good enough for his opponents. And the key philosophical distinction or theological distinction was this. We saw it last week in terms of Arianism, in terms of the Armenians, but two approaches. One of them was this monophysitism versus diophysitism. In monophysitism, the argument was that that Christ has a single nature within which you have the human and the divine, although ultimately the divine overrides the human. To later on, I think the church declared this a heresy much later on, but this was unacceptable to Nestorius. It was particularly argued by a rather nasty churchman named Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria. The opposing side there was Diophysitism, which was Nestorius' position, and that was that Christ has two loosely united natures, human and divine, all within this one person. We can sort of scratch our heads these days as to why so much energy and contention was put into these, but a lot was, without any question. And so, as a result of this, Nestorius was definitely of the second school of the two loosely united natures. Well, the Council of Ephesus itself was called, and one of the interesting things that happened as a result of this is that the forces were gathering, the churchmen and the patriarchs, there were about 3 or 4 patriarchs, were bringing their forces in, and Cyril, who was able to control the proceedings, rushed them before a bunch of the allies of Nestorius arrived. And so when they took the vote, not only was Cyril's position upheld, but Nestorius was excommunicated. He was out as the Patriarch of Constantinople. He went quietly. He did not put up a huge fuss. He went off, as I said, to Arabia, where he was for the next 20 years. And it might have been that, except that within the East, as it was known, within the East, a great deal was happening, and people really rallied to his side. Now, by the 5th century, we need to keep in mind that by the East, and by the East, I'm talking about primarily sort of areas of modern-day Iraq and Iran, which were under, it was the Persian Sasanian Empire. And there had been a lot of Christian activity at this time, so it wasn't a blank slate. But they were somewhat sort of on the outs compared to, they were on the outs compared to the core of the church activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. And many of them then rallied to the Nestorian cause, to the extent that, in fact, what emerged as a church in the East for a very long period of time was known as Nestorian. So they even adopted that name. A key element was a synod in 486 in Ephesus, and that synod was one that was called by the Easterners. It was not in Constantinople or any of those places. So the Synod of Acacius did a couple of things. It did a bunch of things, but 2 things in particular. One of them was to declare that monophysitism was a heresy. So they were saying, the hell with you guys over to the West. The second thing was that they actually endorsed the marriage of clergy, which had become a big issue. If you look in the Acts and so forth, the early preachers were married, but the idea of a celibate clergy had taken hold, in the Mediterranean areas. So in any case, that was one big difference, and one result of that is that the Church of the East, the Nestorians, thereafter did not enforce any kind of celibacy in terms of their clergy. I would also note that this area of this kind of Persian area became a major scholastic center. So this was not as if all of the learning was going to be over in places like Alexandria. There was a school called the School of Cephas that was founded in 496. It became a major seminary at its height. It had over 1,000 students, and I'm not aware of any photographs of that. But St. Elijah's Monastery is a very, very early Nestorian monastery, and we can get just a sense of what that was like, from this. One of the interesting things about these Nestorians were that they were strong on mission, strong on sort of extending the word, getting the gospel out to different places. And one of the key things that happened, this is in the 490s, was some Nestorian priests who followed a Persian Shah who was on the outs in terms of the empire. He was sort of driven into exile. He fled to the north into the Trans-Caucasus area and to the protection of what were known as the White Huns, the Huns being one of the nomadic groups. The priests with him proceeded to make a lot of converts there. And even after this immediate political crisis ended, in fact, one of the things that we see is a great deal of Nestorian missionary activity, particularly within Central Asia and among nomadic groups and the like. So we see over the course of time, and it's hard to create a real timetable for this in any case, we see large numbers of Nestorian converts being made in particular communities, some of them nomadic, some of them places like the Sogdians and others who were also Zoroastrian and so forth, but many of them seem to have been Christian. The two illustrations here are interesting, I think. The one in the upper right is a Nestorian cross, and the symbolism there comes out of the Sasanian Empire, I think. So you can get a sense of, and by the way, this cross with basically with these long triangles was the distinctive Nestorian cross that could be found for centuries in different places. And in fact, it's a good marker or identifier because the Nestorians were not the only ones active, especially when you get to the 13th century or so, but that is one mark. The bottom right is a really fascinating item. It's a silver platter. The platter itself was 8th or 9th century, but it seems to have been, and was from Sogdia, in other words, Central Asia. It seems to have been a copy of a slightly earlier one from Persia itself. But one of the things that we can see here is, first of all, you see the crucifixion. This is, in fact, the burial. You have a burial vault, not a cave. And then up here is the resurrection. And it's the ascension, and not just the resurrection. You see three key elements of the Christian narrative about the life of Jesus that are put in pictorial form on a silver platter in this particular case. By the way, if any of you have questions, feel free to jump in and ask as I go through this. Sometimes there are interesting background things that I could provide. The single most important thing that we have from the Nestorian tradition comes from China. It's interesting because it basically, among other things, happens to be the longest text. It's utterly fascinating, and it provides absolute proof about the role of the Nestorians in China, basically in the 7th and 8th centuries as key times. The story behind this was that in 1623, this is the late Ming Dynasty, a workman happened to be digging in an area just outside the city of Xi'an. Xi'an is the city that has the terracotta warriors and so forth, and it was for centuries the capital of China under the name of Chang'an, including the Tang dynasty, which is an important thing. In any case, they unearthed this gigantic stone stele. In size, it was 9 feet in height, 3 1/3 feet in width, over 1,700 characters being each of the Chinese symbols. And you can see them, sort of piled here. They would be read top to bottom, right to left, and apparently within it there were some 70 or so Syriac names as well. The heading up here, if you see up there, it says Da Qin Qing Jiao Liu Xing Zhongguo Bei. And so what that literally means, the Bei is a monument commemorating the propagation of the Daqin luminous religion to China. Daqin was a name that was used for Syria, for Rome, and so forth. It comes from, in fact, the first empire in China was the Qin Empire. And so the Daqin was the great Qin. It's a term that they had used for a great empire, far off to the west. And you do literally have when you have this notion of flourishing, it's literally propagation. So it's literally, this is how it came to China. 1,700 characters, even if I were to read through a translation, it would probably take our whole hour. But here is a key section, one of the early sections that I thought was worth describing at length. Let me read it for you as well. When the accomplished Emperor Taizong began his magnificent career in glory and splendor, behold, there was a highly virtuous man named Aloabun in the kingdom of Daqin. Auguring from the azure sky, he decided to carry true sutras with him, and observing the course of the winds, he made his way through difficulties and perils. Thus, in the 9th year of the period Zhenhuan, that corresponds to 635, he arrived at Chang'an. The emperor dispatched his minister, Fang Xuanling, with a guard of honor to the western suburb to meet the visitor and conduct him to the palace. The sutras were translated in the imperial library. His Majesty investigated the way in his own forbidden apartments, and being deeply convinced of its correctness and truth, he gave special orders for its propagation. And then it goes on from there and has a lot of sort of history of the Nestorians and so forth. The text itself is dated 731. He's talking about events that began a century before that in the 630s. Yeah. How would they do it? Well, they would do it overland. I mean, for centuries, there had been connections back and forth, between Europe and China. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the Roman Empire, the very first name that the Romans had for this vast territory way off to the east that they didn't know much about was Ceres, S-E-R-E-S, which comes from silk. Because in fact, in the Roman Empire, silk was enormously popular and expensive. There were complaints that it was driving the country bankrupt because of the demand for the beautiful gauze silks and so forth that existed. So there were connections. There was a steady stream of commerce going back and forth. And one other element of this, given the earlier missionary activity, is that in fact there probably were communities of Nestorians all the way through, along the so-called Silk Route. I'm sorry I did not put a map in here. That probably would have been helpful. And then a little further background: the Tang Dynasty, which is dated something like 610 to 610 or so to 907, is one of the great dynasties in Chinese history. Culturally brilliant, very cosmopolitan. So it had people from many different areas. We know that there were Manichaeans from Manichaeism. There were Zoroastrians. After the 7th century, in the late Tang, we have Islam. Obviously Buddhism. So there were a lot of religions. The predecessor for Emperor Taizong had been anti-Buddhist, basically anti-religious, and but Taizong himself changed all of that. And so that's one of the reasons why he's so open and accommodating to the Christians who came in. Sutra, by the way, is the term that is used for Buddhist scriptures. The Chinese were quite happy to use it for Christian scriptures as well. Any other questions about this? So with this, we do have indications, that the Nestorians had a very good go of it, during the Tang Dynasty. In other parts of the stele, it did say that there was a command that a Christian monastery would be built in every prefecture. There were 340 some prefectures in Tang China. It's unlikely that was the case, that actually happened. But there are, in fact, we do have sort of, I think, many textual references to at least 11 different Christian monasteries in different parts of the country. That there was a secondary capital in Luoyang, in Sichuan. And as a matter of fact, one of the places that they had it was a mountain called the Xi'an, which was one of the very holy mountains in Buddhism. So that we do know that they were to be found in many different parts of the country. My guess is that the Nestorians tended to have mainly foreigners as converts and as participants, rather than the quote-unquote Han Chinese. I mean, who the Chinese were in this period is a problematic thing, but in any case, there were people, sort of participating in what we think of as Chinese culture. And just as early Buddhism seemed to first have catered to merchants, probably something like that occurred with the Nestorians, although we don't know for sure. So the illustration here is quite interesting. It's 8th century. Kocho is in the slight borderlands of China today. It's near Xinjiang, I believe. But what we see here, is an example. It's a Nestorian priest with his attendants over here, and it's a Palm Sunday procession. Or at least so. I'm not sure how the identifiers identified purely that this is Palm Sunday, but that is what is given there. But without question, this is something that could look very familiar to us as well, looking at the Orthodox tradition or the Catholic tradition. Now, an interesting thing is that after this period in the Tang Dynasty, there's a kind of a silence within China itself. We don't see reports of the Nestorians, and or actually of a kind of a Christian presence. I think that there may have been a couple of reasons for that. The major dynasty after that, the Song Dynasty, it's one that I've spent most of my life studying, was one that was relatively cut off from the Silk Road with other important kingdoms around. It was a dynasty that really emphasized Confucian learning and was not quite as accommodating to foreign religions, even though we do have the first really documented presence of the Jews in the city of Xi'an in the 11th century. But that to the side, I think it possible that the Nestorians were especially attracted to some of the peoples among China's neighbors as opposed to people within China itself. That at least would help explain the fact that the big turning point, or at least the next big flowering, is under the Mongols. So the Mongols, were this nomadic people that arose at the end of the 13th century in the year, actually the end of the 12th century, because you have Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan emerging as the Great Khan just after the year 1200, and much of the next 75 years or so involved the Mongol conquest of much of the Eurasian world, creating the greatest landborne empire in history. So they made their way as far as Europe was. They made their way to Hungary. They captured Baghdad. They invaded Russia, etc. So that they were in many different parts of the world. We do see, with the Mongols, once again a very visible Nestorian presence. One of the earliest allies of Genghis, somebody who was from another tribal group, not Mongol, but very allied to them, was in fact a Nestorian. We have lots of records of high-ranking people. There was a Tangut state, for example, where the queen was Nestorian. It's quite possible that I think Kublai Khan's queen was perhaps a Nestorian. So we have sort of a lot of indications of that. We also have the fact that, in the 13th century, after the Mongols almost conquered Europe, in response to that, the Europeans, first the Pope, but also King Louis X in France, sent investigators, Franciscan monks, to go into Mongol territories to figure out what was going on. And one of the most noteworthy of these was a Franciscan by the name of William, who wrote a fascinating account, which is easily available in translation. It goes on for a couple of hundred pages or so about this, and he encounters he encounters Nestorians left and right. He also mentions Armenian Christians, and others. But the Nestorians really irked him because they had different theological ideas from what he did. They didn't do the rituals quite right, etc. And so, in his account, you see a lot of complaining, and he talks about having theological arguments with Nestorian priests that he wins, etc. I was thinking about that when Glenn was talking about competition in the sermon this morning. but in any case, so specifically in China, though, the Mongols were very accommodating to the Nestorians. They were basically, again, accommodating to all religions, much more than in other periods, even more than in the Tang when I was talking about that. They made use of Buddhism, Taoism, Islam. They welcomed in Manichaeans, etc., but also Nestorians. And Marco Polo also has references to the Nestorians, so we know that they were there. But not only did it go to accommodation, but also to actually imperial patronage, on the part of the Mongol rulers, particularly Kublai Khan, but not only him. And so we just a couple of things here, just to indicate this presence. In 1313, you have a Nestorian bishop named Mar Solomon, and he is identified in one of the Chinese sources as having authority over the Nestorians around the country, but also the Manichaeans, which is very strange, because the Manichaeans, a Persian religion, which was very focused on the struggle between good, light and dark, good and evil, is one where they certainly would not have considered themselves Christian, even though they borrowed certain things from Christianity. Still, so we have this funny kind of pairing, in this one document. There's also one of the Europeans sent a lot of missionaries themselves as well. And so we have a Catholic presence in the late 13th and early 14th century in China. There was actually an archbishop, a Catholic archbishop in China, and they were very well treated. Sometimes at the getting the Nestorians upset when they felt that the Catholics were sort of going into their own territory. But there was one of the minor Catholic missionaries who was in China in 1330 had this to say about the Nestorians. He said they have very beautiful and orderly churches with crosses and images in honor of God and of the saints. They hold many offices under the said emperor and have great privileges from him. He goes on to say in this passage, that it's too bad, that we've been able to get our act together. It's possible that we could have Christianized the Mongols entirely. Marco Polo makes a thing of this too. He argues that Kublai was very well disposed to Christianity, and there's a kind of a sense in his writings that it's too bad that it didn't quite work out that Kublai converted to Christianity. That was a thought that was sort of drumming in the background of all Christians probably at that time. But here again, so in the 14th century, we can identify within China, a Nestorian community and a Catholic, and by this I mean a Catholic community answering to Rome. And then we have a really fascinating individual, another Nestorian. In fact, he's probably the last really famous Nestorian in the historical tradition, by the name of Rabban Sauma. His dates are roughly 1225 to 1297. So he was a Nestorian Chinese from northern China. By Chinese, I mean he had been born and grew up in the Grecian area of modern day Beijing, which was also the Mongol capital, and there was a substantial community there, and we know from the accounts of his life, etc. But fairly early on, he determined to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and that was his goal that he wanted. and he was his friends and relatives and so forth tried to dissuade him, but he was determined to do it. One of his friends, known to history as Mark, decided to accompany him. So the two of them took off. The illustration here is an interesting one because this is a seal, a document from Monke, who was the great Khan for a period of time in the middle of the 13th century. Middle of the 13th century at the time when they were setting out. This is before Kublai, I guess. But in any case, Monke gave them this seal, which would help them travel safely within all Mongol territories. And the seal is in Mongolian, I think Mongolian perhaps, and Persian. As a way of, I can't read either, so I can't give you a translation. But in any case, and you can see right at the middle of it, of course, is the distinctive Nestorian cross. So what happened with that? So let me go back here. So they made their way through a good deal of difficulty. It took them a while to travel, and they made their way to Baghdad, which at that point was the headquarters, the center for this Church of the East, the Nestorian Church. And they happened to get there when the ecclesiastical hierarchy there was in disarray. And one of the things that happened not long after they got there was that the clerics in Baghdad fastened on Mark to become the new patriarch, Catholicus, and so he was chosen patriarch even though he was a total outsider with very little experience. But he became the patriarch, and Rabban himself was given a variety of responsibilities and so forth there. Now, who were the authorities in Baghdad at the time? Well, this is after 1256, and so what we have are the Ilkhans, and the Ilkhans were a branch of the Mongols who had conquered basically the territory of Iran and much of Iraq, and so they were in control there. They were in control for the next century or so. Ultimately, the Ilkhans in the 14th century converted to Islam, but initially they had not. They were, they participated in various kinds of Mongol beliefs and so forth, but they were certainly very hospitable, to the. So anyway, so he did go back to Baghdad. He finished out his life, wrote of his travels, and sort of that was sort of the end of that story. There were many travelers who went from Europe to China. He was the only one who went from China to Europe. Although I might add, if you're a travel buff, one has to remember who lived in the 14th century, an Arab from northern Africa who traveled more than anybody else in the pre-modern era. I mean, over 400,000 miles around Europe. He was a judge in India for a while. He went to China, etc. But Rabban, again, is unique in terms of his having been from China and making his way all the way to Europe. So what happened, with the Nestorians after that? They in Asia, or at least the Central Asia, China, and so forth, they really seem to disappear. We have very little left of them. My own sense is probably it's a result of the spread of Islam. That in places like the Trans-Caucasus, the area of modern Kazakhstan, and so forth, areas where there had been, in fact, a lot of Nestorians. Those were areas where Islam came in and did a fairly complete job of converting people to Islam. We see that today in terms of the Islamic world in Central Asia, etc. So there was that. Now in the Middle East, it's interesting, heartland, I thought, of parts of Islam, that they were able to benefit from a long-standing tradition within Islam of allowing of allowing minority sort of sectarian communities to function on their own. We know a lot about Jewish communities doing sort of semi-self-governing and doing this. There were Christian communities as well. They could function peacefully as foreigners, except that they had a special tax that was placed upon them as non-Muslims. So I think, given all of that, they were able to continue on particularly in modern Iraq. They seem to have been centered around the area of Mosul to the north. There were quite a few followers who were Kurdish. I think there's a Kurdish connection with them. So there was that. The other interesting element has to do with India. In southern India, I don't know if any of you have heard of the St. Thomas Christians in the far south. This is a tradition that is firmly believed in India. I'll have a few slides to show you about that. The disciple Thomas, the one who doubted Jesus' resurrection, or doubted he had his fingers in his wounds and so forth, that he made his way to India and made converts and began the church in South India during his lifetime. And was martyred there, according to the traditional accounts. There is an apocryphal gospel of Thomas that has a lot of these details and so forth. It's not accepted, I think, by the Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestants, but still it is one of these early documents that exists. And it is firmly believed. So what was their connection? Well, they were linked to this Church of the East all the way through this period that was focused more in Baghdad. As a matter of fact, then in the early 19th century, it took the name of the Assyrian Church of the East. At the time, this reflected a slightly earlier break that they had with another group of Nestorians, Church of the East people who had decided to go into full communion with the Catholic Church in Rome. The Assyrian Church of the East did not, and as far as I know, still even to today, they are still going. Is not in communion as such. They are independent of that. But their sort of most active area in many ways has to do with this southern India, the area around Kerala, Madras, or Chennai, and so forth. So that is the tradition. I put this little blurb up at an advertisement for a friend of mine, a colleague in the history department, a brilliant scholar named Nathan Andrade, who does classical history. And he has this new book, just came out this last year, called The Journey of Christianity to India in Late Antiquity. And he uses all of the sort of historical sources that are available, what we know about networks and so forth, to give a sense of when this happened. He's pretty definitively shows that Thomas was not involved personally, but that nevertheless, it was a very, very ancient church there, a tradition that would be fully worth a forum presentation on its own, because there's a lot about that that would be available. And they have continued to have a flourishing community centered in Chennai. In 2015, I had a chance to make a visit. I spent some time going around southern India and make a visit to Chennai. And so a couple of interesting things to see here. This is on top of this hill, and the hill is known as the St. Thomas Mount. And again, according to their tradition, this was the site of his martyrdom. In something like 46 AD, something like that. And then beneath is this beautiful church. It's called the St. Thomas Basilica. Again, in Chennai, and external and internal. I don't know the dates of that. They certainly don't go back to Thomas's time, but it is a sign, that we do still have, this flourishing, sort of. Not a remnant, but really, sort of a descendant almost, of these early theological debates, divisions, and so forth, and an Asian story very different from the story that we get in Europe, in the Mediterranean, or as we will see next week with our talk next week, the Ethiopia and the Ethiopian Church, which is an equally sort of ancient tradition. So that's the end of my slides. I don't have any grand conclusions to give you here, except that I think that it is very useful for us to be mindful, of the fact of the great richness of Christian history, that it goes well beyond, just what we usually think of, as Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, it has taken many different forms. Of course, a part of the reason for that has to do with the fact that people often couldn't get along with each other. They argued over theology. They argued over corruption. I mean, if you read church history, there's lots of nasty stuff that goes on. And yet, through all of that, one of the things that we see are these emergence of these really fascinating traditions. And as far as my own study is concerned, these two sort of interludes in the Tang dynasty and under the Mongols are periods when, in fact, we can see Christianity as playing, a significant role in the history of China as well. So that's as much as I have prepared. We have a few minutes. I would be glad to take any questions. Yeah.
I had something that a long time ago, and there was a Christian presence there, and the children were baptized in the Catholic Church, but I thought that was because the church was explored.
Yes. So Goa is a different situation. So the story with Goa, I mean, the Europeans come into India at the very end of the 15th century. Vasco da Gama, 1498. And so once they come in, they bring with them, obviously, sort of Catholic Christianity and also a very proselytizing form of Christianity. I mean, spreading the faith was one of the reasons for the expansion of Europe. And then you have the Jesuits playing a major role, from the middle of the 16th century on. So you have all of this that is going on, with that. And so they bring along, their own priests, their own ways of doing things, and so forth, and are not very hospitable towards the Thomas Christians, even though actually there is a shrine within the St. Thomas Basilica. I have a slide of that. I did not put that in, indicating that it was St. Francis, who's very much associated with Goa and Asia and so forth, did a retreat at this church, at this site for a period of time, and it was helpful to him. So they were at least, considered each other to be Christians. But then in Goa itself, you have a central square there with these gorgeous, like 3 different beautiful, basically Renaissance churches, that are there, and they're quite spectacular, but definitely European Catholic.
And I'm not sure how this relates to the religion piece, but somehow in Goa they were able to avoid the caste system or gloss over the caste system. It's not for the architects in India are from Goa because the masons are in one caste and the plumbers are in another caste and the painters in another caste. So it's really hard to build a building in India when you have to do it on various castes. But the Goan architects could talk there.
Well, that's true. I mean, Goa, which is more than just a little port city. I mean, Goa is a territory that maybe runs 30 or 40 miles along the coast, and beautiful beaches. It's one of the reasons why it's a big tourist spot. But in fact, and so it was under Portuguese control all the way down to the early 1960s. And as a result of that, I mean, you're quite right that they Christianized it as much as they could. Goans often will have Portuguese names. So given all of that, I mean, you're quite right, that with a more European style society, you did not have those caste distinctions, which certainly you do have elsewhere.
Is that affiliated with the Christianity aspect, or that was just something in parallel?
Well, I mean, it's, I think associated perhaps with the the general sort of European culture, which would have included Christianity. Yeah, I guess that's how I would view it. It had lots of contention too. You had different orders at each other's throats. The Dominicans and the Franciscans and the Jesuits and so forth often had trouble living with each other. Anyway, well, there's no reason we have to stay absolutely until 12:30. So why don't we end for today? Thank you all. And do come back if you can next week. Beniam Awash, who is our speaker next week, is a fascinating young man, a really great guy. I know him especially well because he was an assistant of mine for a year or two at the university when he was a graduate student. He's an assistant professor of science, I think it is, at SUNY Oneonta, and his background is Ethiopian, and I think that his background to some extent was the Ethiopian church that he'll be talking about, which is very, very ancient and really, really fun. So see you all then. Have a good week.